Welcome, everybody. It's a big pleasure for me to kick off the Virtual Ops 2020 season in this year. Some of you have attended the Ops 2020 in Miami and in Berlin. Unfortunately, due to the COVID situation, we will not make such an event this year. So we thought we'd do it virtually. Many of you are already in our virtual happy hour sessions, and we want to exactly make use of the same concept and format for the upcoming weeks and talk about business. And so the idea for today's session is that Martin Sedlacek from Lufthansa Consulting is giving a presentation around about 30 minutes. Some of you have maybe seen this presentation during the IBS operations conference. Martin and me, we know each other since I think 2013-14.
Yeah, 14.
At that time, I was working for a German IT supplier, and I was inventing the so-called Operations Management Day, which we call Ops 2020 under the IBS flag. And I thought what he presented during the Agifos conference might be also inspiring the aviation industry experts as well. So we will then, after the presentation, start a panel discussion. On the other hand, all of you being in the virtual happy hour, you are used that even during a country presentation, all the attendees can already ask questions while digesting the information conveyed. So that's also something I would encourage. Hopefully, Martin, you're okay with that you're not getting all the questions at the end of the presentation, because we really want to have a very lively dialogue and foster the communication, because we think this concept is much more dynamic than a one-direction webinar where at the end people can just send out some text-based questions. And then we also want to discuss with you what might be a next session in our series of Virtual Ops 2020 season events, and that's then something for later. Just also to give you a background about all the people, maybe during the later discussion, everybody is potentially introducing himself, but we have here really a big bunch of industry experience and know-how today to gather here in this panel discussion. So while seeing this bunch of airline logos, I'm really impressed from the brain pool we have now here during this panel discussion. And so I would now encourage to start Martin with the presentation. And for that, you just have to start the screen sharing that all the attendees can see your presentation.
All right. So, can you see it?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. So, thank you for the opportunity, Daniel. And I'll start with the introduction then. I am actually coming from the operations control and dispatch area, which you will see it in the presentation. And I started like 18 years ago in Czech Airlines at the operations control center. Then I moved in 2010 to EasyJet, where I was working again at the dispatch/operations control. And since 2014, I'm working for Lufthansa Consulting, obviously focusing on all operational topics, working internally and externally. So I was, for example, 2 years part of the Air Berlin integration into the Lufthansa Group on the operational side, but I've done quite a few of nice projects from Argentina to Asia. And today I want to show you the results of the survey which we have done last year, towards the end of the year, when we all saw what was happening in the airline operations like 2018, 2019, and it wasn't only the Europe, but also, especially in 2019 in the US and everywhere around the world, you saw a lot of capacity shortages, disruptions, not only costs, but very negative PR. Obviously, especially in Europe, ongoing high bankruptcy rates. a never-ending push for effectivity, and we wanted to understand a little bit what is actually happening in the airline operational excellence part, and I'll get what do I mean by that. Why, if there are relatively a lot of developments, why in reality not much is changing, and why we are still operating like 20 years ago, really, when I started in the aviation. But before I get to it, let me tell you a little bit about the survey itself. So we defined the operational excellence easy as per the CETA definition, so optimized use of resources, effective handling of disruptions, and delivering customer satisfaction. And we focused intentionally on schedule and operations planning, operations steering or operations control, and performance management, not only performance internal of the operations control and the planning, but also performance of the provider. And in terms of the respondents, we were quite happy to get 55 responses, which I would say is very good, especially as we were lucky to get a very nice share across all the regions, business models. You can see that we have quite a high share of low-cost carriers. And also in terms of the size, yes, almost or over half of the airlines were like 11 to 50 aircraft, but we had the airlines up to several hundred of the aircraft. And if you look at the percentages, don't get confused. Like I always use the example of Australia, where we say we have 5% of the participants, but that's within the survey. But in reality, I think like 75% of the airlines in Australia participated in our survey. So let's get to what we have learned or how we have approached it. And we have started at the beginning relatively generally. So we wanted to understand how the airlines are actually setting up the on-time performance targets, and if they have the operational excellence programs, what are also the targets of them. And it's nothing really surprising. So on the OTP, of course, you always want to balance the OTP and the costs. You want to achieve highest customer satisfaction. Some people take into consideration also the local limitations of the operations, especially with operations in the busier hubs. And also the competitive landscape, of course, from time to time, although I have to admit that I was surprised that it's relatively only the third, because it always seems that people are talking about it a lot, about competition, but in the end they don't care, at least on the operational side, so much. And on the operational excellence or improvement programs, similar, like how majority of the airlines want to improve the robustness. Of course, the cost is important, and once again, you see the customer satisfaction. So that's like what they claim. But when you come and ask the questions in the survey, and we had like 55 questions, or 50, then you realize that that's kind of dream, but the reality is a little bit different. For example, on the side of the operational costs, it's like, yeah, it's at the target, but in the end, no one is really able to identify the disruption costs, even on the high level. I'm not talking that you need to know really to the last digit to identify the costs. On the customer satisfaction, everyone is talking about it, but again, you will see on later slides that in terms of how do we communicate with the customer, or how do we let the customer to control the disrupted journey, it's a little bit a different story. And with the robustness, it was quite funny, because yeah, they all say we want the robust operations, and in the next question you ask them, do you have the robust operations? And 50% say no, we don't. And of course, it was the pre-COVID view, but I will also get to it towards the end of the presentation. But from my perspective, not so much changes. There, of course, there will be some things will be relaxed, some things will be tougher because of the COVID, but in general, the results, in my opinion, are still valid. And one more interesting thing, which we realized when asking them about really the targets, was that most of them will say, yeah, we identify the targets realistically, but once you start exploring if they really communicate those targets, you know, if it's clear in to the people across the organization, you realize that the story is a little bit different, and that very often the people just don't know what the targets are. And on the top of that, and that will definitely change the shares because of the COVID. But pre-COVID view was that everyone was complaining, you know, we have the weather, air traffic and airports, and we can't basically do anything about it, where you can already argue that there are some small bits and pieces you can do about it. But importantly, in the end, they'll tell you that the tight schedules, crew and aircraft shortages are also like equal to this, you know. So then you have to ask how much of the disruptions have you created internally, and how much of the disruption you cannot really influence.
Arun, you have raised your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Martin, I was very interested on the robustness part. So as part of your survey, did you also go down into how they were trying to implement robustness? Were they looking at for the 50% who would have robustness, were they trying to do through the schedule planning side, or were they still trying to manage it on the operational side? Did you have any idea along those lines?
Yes, majority of them is trying to do it basically through the buffers. So especially in 2018, it was super obvious, and it was also like, it's no secret, Lufthansa who added, I think, 37 aircraft into the fleet of 750 just to act as a buffer. But the disadvantage of the buffer is, and I'm unfortunately too long in the industry for it, that I've been through too many waves where you add the buffer, you don't change anything at the background. 1 year later, your finance come and say, no, the buffer is too expensive, and you go down. So the usual waves.
Yeah. All right. That's good to know. Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. So we also wanted to understand, of course, if they are satisfied with the operations, and if they have the operational excellence program. It was kind of side question, but I find it quite funny, so I included it here. So like 30% will tell you, no, I'm not satisfied, even if I consider all the external problems which I had. But at the same time, some 30% will tell you, well, we don't have the operational excellence program. So of course, when we looked at the data initially, we thought, okay, that's clear. You have the program, you have relatively good results. You don't have a program, you don't have the results. But the reality is completely different. We turned the numbers up and down like 10 times, and we realized that because it really depends on how you perform such program, that there is absolutely no correlation between having it and having good results. But let's go a little bit more into something really operational.
I think there's a question from MG. You have raised your hand. Yeah. You are muted, MG. MG, you are muted.
If we look at this slide, I think it's very similar to the previous slide. If we look at customer satisfaction, which was 73%, it was just below the cost in operations, but on the excellence program, it was much lower priority. So is that similar to this, where it's important but not important enough to implement?
You might be right, and there is actually one thing which I forgot to say about when there were those targets and about the operational excellence, where they don't even usually include the departments which have something to do with the customer satisfaction in those programs, you know. So yes, they claim it's about the customer, but in the end, it's all about more or less operations, and operations think that they are improving the satisfaction of the customer without having any touch points, without having any feedback. So yeah, in my opinion, it's more like, because everyone says the customer is important, so we put it on our list, but we don't really do something for that.
Sapna, what do you like to ask?
Hi, Martin. Thank you for this interesting presentation. It's really increasing in interest, actually. One question here. It's you've mentioned that these operational excellence programs are a pre-COVID kind of initiation, isn't it? Are you seeing these operational excellence programs sustaining as such during the COVID and post-COVID stage, or do you see changes in priorities set by airlines towards operational performance?
Well, I see a change, definitely. I see a need to continue them, but not really as the programs, because those programs which were here in 2018 and 19 were more like reaction to really bad operational situation and were somehow an add-on. While from my perspective, such approach will not be sustainable anymore, also from the cost perspective, because no one will approve you a special project on the top in the current unpredictable situation. But on the other hand, obviously something has to change into how we are handling the operations. And that was also significant learning of the survey, that it's not only widening gap on the commercial side for the airlines, but also on the operational, like when on the commercial, you have the big airlines more and more having the power in the market and pricing everyone out of the market, the small players. And exactly the same thing is happening on the operational side through capabilities, where big players have, of course, much more capabilities, much more fundings, and then the small players really cannot do anything while sharing the same congested environment. So in my opinion, it has to be somehow plugged into like how you do the daily business. Not that you have like OCC and then some unit on the side which from time to time tries to tell you how to do the things. You listen to it, you say, well, you don't understand my business anyway, and they go away. But from my perspective, really structurally changing approach to some items.
Right. And you see a shift towards more of an OCC side and towards day of operations side, is it? More than a planning side?
I use the OCC, but no, from my perspective, it's really about three pillars, which are planning, steering, and performance management. And you cannot avoid any of them in the end if you want to succeed.
Thank you.
So now let's go to operations, as we said, and it's a good transition because I started with the planning, steering, and performance management, and now we look into planning a little bit, and one of our questions was, how do you do the integrated planning? Because this is something from what I'm very used to from my past experience, and I'm always very surprised with a lot of airlines that they don't have the process where they would really plan somehow along the common premises, KPIs, philosophies, and where they would even talk to the other departments on some level where they would achieve the sustainable result. And it was quite obvious also here, where you see like, network planning, scheduling, crew planning, OCC and CAMO somehow talk together in planning phase. Then you have the ground and flight operations where it goes a little bit down already. And that was especially interesting, especially in the light of the 2018 and 19 capacity shortages, or airspace and airport capacity shortages, where they also, it's real problem. But in the end, no one really communicates with the system and service partners. So system partners like airport ATC, and service partners, the ground handlers and all the other service providers. So that's where I would blame the airlines a little bit, that everyone is trying to optimizing his own thing. But obviously in connected world, it doesn't simply work. So very often if people complain that things don't work, I would go back to the planning and ask them, how do you plan? And
Martin, I have a question on what is your sense on predictive tools? Can you give a sample? What is such predictive tool all about?
That's a good question, because also there the airlines have a little bit different understanding, I think, from the system providers and from the universities and researchers. Because from my perspective, the predictive tools are really turned somehow around the data, trying to forecast what will happen, but trying to forecast really what will happen tomorrow, taking the information on the weather from Eurocontrol and so on, and then based on the past statistics, forecasting what are most likely outcomes of tomorrow in the main areas. But if you ask the airlines what is the core of the predictive tools for them, then they will tell you it's the block time and turnaround analysis, and some of them even pretend how cool it is to do it, when I'm like, I know this from 2002, when we already in Excel did such analysis. So it's definitely one of the issues as well. And I think this is something what was also discussed during the Agiforce, where people don't really like this, that something predicts the result, but still with, let's say, 80% probability, and then it doesn't happen, and people are a little bit scared that they will be responsible for this. So sometimes it's like better to have nothing than being responsible for arguably wrong decision. But that's more, in my opinion, management thing, where also management has to learn to work with this uncertainty.
Arun and Sapna, you both have raised your hands.
Yeah. Hi. So just want to understand. It's good to see that around 80% in the network planning and crew capacity planning sites. So when you say integrated planning process, do you mean end-to-end planning, integration between manpower planning and crew roster planning and feedback loops? Is that how airlines see it? The integrated planning process.
Yes, okay. It is. And as I know the process, it's always at least, or it should be at least done like pre-season preparation in terms of committing, like in Germany, they call it framework conditions, when they all sit together and then they virtually sign off the document where each of them says, okay, I'm able to deliver this production under those conditions. And then they clarify in between, and it's very often actually driven by the scheduling, where they have to, of course, then take all of this into the consideration. But to the other part of your questions, and it goes a little bit to the bottom part of the graphics on those predictive tools, yeah, it's an issue, this end-to-end planning, and you can see it here. It's enough to follow the red dashed line, which is the average of everything. But you can see that like someone is trying to predict and optimize in the network planning, then it goes a little bit down towards the long and short-term operations planning, and then it goes up again to the OCC. But the result, in my opinion, is that it's kind of disrupted. Every optimization is disrupted on the way, and then it comes to the operations control center. And I've seen too many operations control centers who start actually optimizing the things from the beginning again at the operations phase. Daniel, I see that
no, yeah, I pushed the wrong button.
Oh, okay.
Just want to unmute. Sorry. Keep control, please. Keep control.
All right.
But there is a question from Australia. Justin, you raised your hand. By the way, guys, I think also from the Virtual Happy Hour, you can all speak up. Nobody needs permission. You know each other. We are one family. Just ask your question, and I can mute them. Thank you.
I've got probably one comment and one question regarding your bottom piece of data. I think what you're seeing with the decrease in the predictive tools being used in the short-term planning, or between the long-term planning and the live operations, would generally be the result of the amount of ad hoc changes that are occurring in the schedule in the short-term window, in your 3 months or even your 1 month lead up to the day of operation. A lot of this can't be predicted. These are when, even things like events, and at least in Australia in the domestic market, football games get published. They know when the teams are going to be battling one another. So you can't have that in a predictive environment. So I think that's probably part of the result of why you see that decrease in the predictive tools being applied in that window, and then it taking over again. But then you've already got the the schedule in place, and then there is predictive information being used again once it gets to the day of operation to smooth things out. To my question, I guess would be, I'm trying to understand your surprise or your concern of why the department's using predictive tools is dropping off when it gets to external system partners. I mean, the one that I can think of the most is, it just kind of, for me at least, makes sense that it would drop off externally, because main reason they are external. I don't see the point of why would you be wanting to integrate with an external system when all you're doing is, in the most part, feeding information out of your system to other suppliers. the only place where I can think of where this kind of maybe fall over a little bit, but there is already a feedback loop in place is when you come to slot management. So you already have the airports having their own integrative tools to forecast demand, to essentially work out what your slot bucket is, or your slot pool is going to be worth of. And then obviously then you have your slot conference and all the airlines get together and battle it out to get whatever slots they can. And then the whole process starts over again. So you kind of do have integration already there. It's just maybe not really automated integration. And certainly it's kind of in a backward manner, because it's actually, you could actually argue that the integration is actually coming from the outside. Although, sorry, the predictive tools are coming from the outside, and then they're feeding right back to the beginning of the window for the airline.
I mean, yes, but on the other hand, take into consideration, like, the turnaround is one of your major activities, right? And you are outsourcing majority of that to someone, and suddenly it's a completely black box. And very often that guy plans something based on the schedule, you know, that it will not even realize. Like I've seen even the areas where they just publish the seasonal schedule and they don't even do the adjustment. So the ground handler even doesn't know which flight is going to arrive and when. That's of course an extreme, but I'm looking at it really from this perspective.
It's not an extreme. It happens all the time. Just trust me, even in my own business where we have it outsourced, the number of times the ground handler has not gotten our schedule changes is phenomenal. So
yeah,
so it's a lot bigger than you think.
Or no, but and actually good point also with your remark regarding the changes, because this is something what we probably don't see in Europe so much. I would consider our schedules much more rigid, at least pre-COVID. Now it will probably really change, where everyone is waiting like 2 weeks, trying schedule and then trying another schedule if it works. But before there was a relative stability, it was for me more like that a lot of airlines didn't even see the need to have this short-term operations planning, where they just said, and I was talking even to big Middle East airlines where they said, no, how did you even convince your company that it's needed? You know, why would you even need to integrate all those things and shortly before the operations optimize the thing? So it's interesting approach question, I would say.
I mean, I think it all depends on your market. I mean, if you're looking at Europe specifically, just the sheer volume of airports that are operationally constrained kind of puts you into your schedule, and then once you start the 80-20 rule of slot usage, that kind of locks the and so they kind of have no choice but to operate it whether they want to or not. So yeah,
sure,
but yeah, there's a very big adjustment of schedules in Australia. It happens all the time, because when you look at it, it's really only Sydney that's heavily slot constrained. The rest of the airports are fairly open too. I mean, there's a few pinch points here and there, but for the most part, it's certainly nothing like the constraints you see in Europe.
Okay.
Martin, seeing this drop from 53 to 10% and the missing integration with external partners, is the CESAR project in Europe not somehow stimulating more integration exactly of these external partners? Because the CESAR project is out there already since a while, and airports and airlines and ground handlers, and ATC, they should all work together. So is it then just a nice talk, and the reality is that this project is not bringing all these stakeholders closer to each other?
That is a very good question, and I'm happy for it, because I was actually part of the CESAR project for half a year last summer, and well, it was interesting to see it. You are right. There is some increased exchange of the data, but basically it's still happening through the CHMI or the NOP portal, which are very often not integrated into the tools on any side, you know. So yes, hypothetically there is an exchange of the information, but even if I look out of the window, I'm looking at the Frankfurt airport, And the ground handler is receiving, of course, the same information as the OCC of the Lufthansa, but neither of them is able to work fully with this information. And then if you add that there is very often low communication between them, that increases the problem. So in the end, to be honest, I don't have the answer how to handle it, especially the bigger airline you are, the bigger nightmare it is in the big hubs. But the thing is, I think it comes a little bit with the mindset of the operations control. You know, I remember every time when I was sitting there, what are you trying to do? To kind of postpone the decision until the last moment, because the situation is changing and you still want to operate everything. So especially if it comes to the cancellations, you are trying to postpone as much as possible while your flight plans are filed. And there is very often mismatch last 2-3 hours between what is filed and what is going to happen. And all your providers are getting just from the Eurocontrol system some theory, while in your mind there is something completely different. Then you start shuffling it the last moment when it's too late for everyone to work with it. I have some hopes in the Caesar project, especially I saw that they were doing a very good trial, I think in Palma, where they also realized that they have a lot of data and they started pairing the aircraft registration at the back. You know, so even if the airline flew to Palma late and didn't delay the outgoing leg, they just paired the aircraft registrations at the back and forecasted the delay of the outgoing flight already. But overall, there is one big fear with Caesar project, and that's extension of the flight planning window and the negotiation of the business trajectory, if you've heard about it. It's actually because nowadays we have weather well in advance available, and they are talking about planning the optimum trajectory up to the 24 hours before departure, and then kind of negotiating with Eurocontrol if you can get this trajectory or if there have to be changes. And this is what we realized, that it's a nice theory, but the current operations control and dispatch are just not able to handle it from the technology perspective, but also from the way how they work, because they are not used to negotiate something what happens in 24 hours if we are not talking about single flights where there is some specialty.
We're actually having the exact same problem in Australia. There's a very big project going on with ATFM and ACDM. So at the moment, most of the big ports are arrival slots managed, but they're considering, or CASA, Air Services Australia is working on a project with the major airlines in this country to start to also have departure slots. But the problem is the system provider that they're using, which is, I can't remember off the top of my head, can't marry the two systems together. So they can't. They've not yet been able to work out some way of if you have a flight with a departure slot delay, and you know its subsequent flight, to automatically update its next sector's departure and arrival slot. They're having major problems with the business rules with the airline.
Exactly.
Martin, one quick question, not just to Martin, but to everyone in this call. You talk about prediction capability and utilizing the tool. But do you feel that our industry, aviation industry, has the digital maturity when it comes to these kind of data handling? Because Justin earlier touched on a very good point about the seasonal variation, especially during games and other things. And in my experience dealing with our customers and outside, I've seen that kind of the maturity in terms of recent code capturing, or whether it's actually maturity with managing the data, seems to be always on the lower side. And that kind of hampers us, because we could have the best model in the world, and you feed it crap data, you're not going to improve your predictions any better. Now, I've always seen that as a sense, because I have some experience in hospitality and insurance, especially when it comes to prediction models, and the quality of data that I've seen in those domains versus what we have in aviation, it's absolutely in two different levels. So is that something that I feel, or do you guys also have the same kind of a feeling about the data in the industry across? I mean, Europe is better, Eurocontrol is better, the Federal Aviation in US, they have done some things. They have a good data set, but still I feel that the maturity is not good enough for the models to excel. So what are your thoughts?
I'm fully with you, and you will see it on one of the slides later. The data are a disaster, especially if we talk about airline internal data. That
exactly.
It's like airlines are rarely thinking what do they want to do with the data and going backwards. You know, they rather take the data they have and they try to play with it, and then they realize that it doesn't work. And it goes, in my opinion, in two directions. One is really the data quality and availability. And the other direction is also what do I do with the data? Because I have a feeling that in airline industry, we have sometimes like obsession with perfect solutions. You know, instead of starting with predicting small bits and pieces and seeing how it works, we want to solve everything in once. And it, of course, doesn't work. But I always use as an example the weather, you know, and everyone is telling me that it's a problem and that if the thunderstorm comes at 14:45 or 14:50 for a big airline, it can have a huge impact on the operation. So I rather fly everything and then I divert with what I need to rather than some preemptive action. And I was complaining about this, I would say, really 10 years ago already, when we flew in Czech Airlines every night to Russia. And all the Russian regional airports have forecasts for fog in the morning. And sometimes it looks like the machine is generating it, that it doesn't even matter on what are the conditions. You know, the standard is to have the fog. But then the pilot calls you at the operations control, like, what do you think? Will we fly? Should we fly, or should we postpone the flight to the next day because there were visa implications and so on? And I was always asking, why can't someone give me at least, you know, what's the probability of this forecast, given what are the current conditions, this forecast turning right or wrong? Because otherwise it was like if you had a captain who was complaining too much, then you said, okay, I'll rather postpone the flight to the next day straight away because you are whinging so much that you will divert anyway. But absolutely not using the basic data which are available, you know, on the small pieces.
MG, you raised your hand.
Yes, very similar to the question was asked and the answer that was given. In the short-term operations planning, as you were talking about the data on weather that is normally available as forecasted for certain regions. Now, I did a base audit line for an airline in the US, who knows that certain periods of the year it is a hurricane season. We have certain countries that are aware that they have monsoon seasons. Yeah. We have airlines in the Middle East that knows in this month there is a probability of 15 days of fog, which was a big problem in Abu Dhabi. And is that should be part of a short-term operations planning. Now I'm specifically talking about external service partners and external system partners. And weather for me should not be only a day-to-day, but also a short-term planning tool, right? Because we know technology has advanced, that we know a month or two in advance that what type of season it would be. So can we predict what that effect has on our operations, or at least have some modeling that we can say, okay, here is the different scenarios that we can plan for. Now, other external systems and service partners that I can think of is hotel accommodation availability. Now we're looking at COVID. That is a problem. We know in advance that that's external system partners. There might be a problem. Ground operation informations, training slots, right? And short-term operational planning. We know now there is there's a rush to get everybody trained due to recency in issues. That's a short-term planning. Why is that not integrated as a predictive tool? Same with revised flight times, slots and note times. So for me, the short-term operational planning should have a higher application than it is currently used. I don't know that everybody maybe agrees on that or has a different opinion to what I've said.
From my side, I fully agree.
I agree. Yeah.
I just, MG, I just don't think you can. I mean, you've kind of, unless I misunderstood, you've kind of contradicted yourself, because you've said that like things like this should be planned and yeah, like integrated, but then you're on the other hand, you're also saying that, oh, we don't know when a weather event is going to happen. Like, you got a rough idea, but you'll never know when it is. So like, I guess the one example that I can use is a time in Qatar, and it happened every year, and they never ever learned from it, from my years in Qatar Airways, is the fog season in northern India. So they would build a schedule where flights would, most of the majority of the year they're arriving in India, like northern India, at 2-3 o'clock in the morning, turning around and coming back to the Middle East. During that part of the year, where the fog was there, they had to always push it, the whole schedule, the whole Indian schedule, about 4 or 5 hours later, so that they were arriving at 9 o'clock in the morning. So they were after fog. But year after year, they would always wait until the first time that would actually start to impact the schedule, and then make the changes, because they knew once it started, it lasted for a month. So they kind of had that predictive information going into what they wanted to do, but they couldn't predict when it was going to start. And what I would have loved them to do, and they did get a little bit along the way of trying to automate some of the changes. But when you're making, particularly with the schedule, making massive schedule changes like that, there is always going to be an element of manual intervention required to make sure everything lines up. And if any system provider can somehow remove some of particularly the human error that gets mixed up in massive schedule changes like this when they're done at the last minute, they're going to have a very successful tool.
I agree, it's not perfect. I agree, it's not perfect, but it definitely needs some talking about and thinking, and even if just it's scenario planning on manpower planning, on what is available. Okay, if we have because in Etihad we had a fog season and it was almost to the day. If you have that data of over the last 50 years, you have some idea, but you are right. It's not a constant, so it is more difficult.
Sapna, you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to discuss a thought with the group that I was reading a while back. So we talked about predictive analytics, but do you think there will be kind of a data restructuring in these 1 or 2 years going on? Because now all the way operations are done would be different. The data that's coming in would be different from probably January to maybe 2021 or 2022. Does that mean you'd be able to create a good predictive model by just looking at past, or would it be right to mix up data now and then? So do you see a kind of restructuring in data? Do you see a new data on which predictive analytics might run? So that's one of the thoughts I want to discuss. And the other one related to what was being discussed, the quality of data in the airline operations world. Could it also be because of disparate systems not being able to communicate in good industry standards? Would that improve the situation? And do you think we would be going towards that? So that's two thoughts I thought would be good for me to understand and discuss with you.
Great source of now. I'll actually give you my very simple definition for that, right? So if you take the normal prediction models and you normally pitch in like last 3 years, 4 years of data, depending on the nature of the model, and then you give them what's happening in the last 2 months, they're just going to take it, identify them as outliers, and throw them out, because that's completely that completely doesn't make sense. That would be a standard model. But nowadays, what's being discussed about is to actually understand the the diversity of that particular data which has been classified as an outlier, and to actually bring that in so that in future scenarios which emits these kind of unforeseen or previously not seen situations, we will derive from that and then do a prediction. So just to give you so basically based on what we are currently working on. So it's not like we will have to completely restructure the data, but then yes, we will have to look at some parts of this pre-data processing part or data engineering part to actually, not to completely throw away this data because this is going to be an emerging trend, and then do some tweaks to it. But a few days down the line, maybe in another couple of months, we will again, might have to relook at this. So today, from our perspective, we are not going to completely change our data engineering models because we don't know whether this is going to be a very short instance, which we can consider classify as outliers and leave them out, and then maybe in future take a model which is more or feed it into our AI models rather than our normal machine learning models. So that would be my response to that.
Sorry, guys, with these models, with just like with what you're talking about the data, do you think there's a way, or is there a way now where, say, this year's data across pretty much everything is ring fenced, so we can obviously exclude it from using it in a normal year, but then keep it ring fenced in a way that we can apply it to other scenarios, say. Heaven forbid there's another 9/11 which shuts down air traffic again, that we could quickly implement the use of the data there to see how we recover.
Absolutely. So, Justin, that's a very good question. So, I don't have much examples to keep from the aviation domain because we are still firefighting. But if you look at places like hospitality, in places where there is more about in certain manufacturing sectors, this data is actually being taken into consideration because and almost all models that we are talking to. Let me just give. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm more of a student than an experienced practitioner. But recently, what we have been seeing is yes, this data is looked upon very, very valuably because we don't get these kind of situations over and over again. So we get a lot of insights into some of our processes and some of the way that the data interacts with each other from this. So, in short, yes, this is a very valuable data set for us. Yes, and there's lots of discussion going on how to use these models to actually incorporate improvements into the models that we have already got.
So just to all the audience, because and that's also hopefully okay for Martin, we have of course foreseen to have the presentation and then the panel discussion after, but you are realizing that we are really having both together. I hope, Martin, this is okay for you, because
sure.
I think you were used to just make the presentation and get the questions at the end.
No problem.
And I have to admit, I like this dialogue pretty much more than, and I hope you like it too.
No problem at all. And one thing which I wanted to say to the data, I'm a little bit split on it actually, because I think we have to be careful. We have burned ourselves with the data in the past quite heavily already, and now it might get even worse in a way. Like of course, if we are talking about weather data and all this stuff, that's not a function of the traffic, so that's okay. But I would be very careful now when using the data which are function of the traffic, because we were growing over the years, right? And in my opinion, now we will get really like 10 years back, probably. But do we have the data from this period, or can we approximate? Can I take the data 2018, which was operationally very difficult year full of slots, and can I approximate 2021 with that when I know that actually the traffic will not be so heavy, So that's, in my opinion, something a little bit difficult. And then to the other part on the data standards and those things, that's actually something where I see the role of the providers, system providers or IT providers, because in my opinion, if you let airline to choose, and to play, it will rarely lead somewhere to something really tangible, because the main working tool of the airlines are anyway external IT systems. So in my opinion, I would see it more like at least the best practice being pushed into those systems and forcing the airlines to start collecting the data for it, to take advantage of it, rather than waiting what the airline somehow built on site, and then it will be the first thing which will stop be using during any disruptions, because we just don't have time to look into tool number 25 if you even remember the login and password.
Yeah, you actually bring up a really good point. Two of my very close ex-colleagues are now, one's the head of revenue management in Flyadeal in Saudi Arabia, and the other one is the head of or general manager revenue management in Hong Kong Express. And both of them more or less said, yeah, we're just going to completely throw out the data for this year and just completely ignore everything. But so Flyadeal is using RMS, so ARM for their revenue management system, and sorry, the other way around, and Hong Kong Express is using PROS. And both of them, both the system providers are actually really working or spending a lot of time and energy with their airlines to process their data to somehow use the historical data like from a normal year or during a normal, say, low season to what is actually happening now. So at least the airline has a little bit of a fighting chance to get some kind of yield upside out of the traffic that is materializing without pricing it too high that they're scaring it away. It's quite interesting to see how these two system providers, who usually just sit there and just collecting the money from the system used, to actually putting in the effort to working with their carriers to use their system to the full advantage.
Well, it is my understanding that 2020 has been cancelled. Our Christmas tree is up already.
It really should be, I think.
Okay, then I suggest we move one more slide forward.
Yes, please.
Maybe to get some new topics. And that was when we were looking into the operations control itself. And we wanted to see how empowered is actually the OCC staff when the things start happening. And first of all, we of course looked into how what are they spending the time on, and that's nothing surprising, to be honest. Like, of course, you monitor the situation, you prepare solution, you execute. Like manual data securing and insertion into the system still on 35%. Well, I would love this to be less, but it is what it is at the moment. But overall, really nothing where you could make any assumptions based on it. But then you ask them how you make the decisions, and then you see that there are significant drops where majority of them will tell you, yeah, of course, experience-based. Then 63% dynamic scenarios, which actually quite surprised me, because I was under impression that the next one, the fixed scenarios, which are really pre-prepared, are more prevalent in the industry than pushing the button just when the problem happens. And you see that the advanced data processing and automation is almost non-existent. So we said, okay, so you make the decision based mainly on the experience. So how are you supporting this? And what are your rules and their clarity for the flight prioritization, for example, during the disruptions? And there you can see that like 60% people will tell you, oh yeah, we have some gray zones where we can creatively play. You know, our humans with experience can creatively play with the rules. And of course, like people who don't have the rules are somehow equal to people who have the perfect rules, but that will always be happening. But then we said, okay, and how are you actually working with your people that they are able to manage all of this? And me having gone through X years of training, it's not surprising that always they'll say, yeah, for the OCC, the minimum legal training is usually the basics. Sometimes we add something from the past situation, some scenario exercises, and very few of them emerging trends. But when I remember all my IATA flight dispatcher training, it's actually all about flight planning. You know, there is absolutely no training as a legal minimum for disruption handling. So we are also still handling all the staff at the OCC through the same trainings mainly. and then we are surprised. So that was for me a little bit also part of the problem, where we are pretending that we have all the tools and that we are automating, but in the end we have the people who make the decisions with very wide room for reading the rules, and where we don't really train them properly. And then of course the system starts falling apart every time when there is some bigger disruption. Not mentioning that also this experience is something what I always challenge, because for me it was like when I was working at the OCC, I went to work 12 times per month. So it was Monday morning, Wednesday evening, Saturday night, and then it's really a question if my experience, if something what I thought is the experience was as valuable as if someone gave me some statistical data, what is happening in reality and not in my head. So it would be interesting.
Martin, that's a good point. And I asked earlier this question about what is understood under predictive tools. So I think it was 78% as figure. And now seeing what you exactly mentioned, the reality is different. So have you been asking the same people? Have you asked the operations controller whether they have a predictive tool? Because if yes, then I'm really amazed that on one hand people say, yeah, I have a tool, but I prefer to do manual data capturing instead of using this predictive tool.
Well, overall, we asked usually on the level of the OCC managers, because we didn't want to have actually from one airline where you have 6 different opinions. But what you are mentioning, in my opinion, it's coming from 2 directions. One direction is, yes, some tools are available, but they are really not usually integrated. They are not intuitive. And it's the function of the workload, right? And of the human ergonomy. How do you work, or what do you do? How do you start getting rid of the things once you get under the pressure? And the other thing, and that might be more from the countries with, let's say, stronger unions and social systems. I've seen also examples where people said, yeah, we have it. It's actually quite, but we use it 5 times per month, just not to upset management that we are not using it, but we don't want to use it too often because we are afraid that then they will not need the same amount of us. But that's the extreme, I would say. The main thing, in my opinion, is that there is a discrepancy between what the management thinks that is available and what can be practiced under the standard workload of the operations control.
But the question will be then, is COVID-19 changing this? Will airlines now take actions to change this behavior? Because on one hand, you invest into something, then it's not used. Or will this state of the industry continue forever?
I'm a little bit pessimistic in this. I don't think COVID itself will change something, because there you are touching the thing of the human management, right? It also to great extent has nothing to do with the systems. It's just how are you managing your employees? How are you enforcing the standards at your workplace? And I don't think that necessarily just the people will have some time now that they will have they will start doing things on their own. We all like our standards, and we have certain mindset, and yeah, there will be few clever people who will say, yes, let's use the opportunity. But I'm afraid that the most of the people in the industry will be more like scared with bad news which are coming every day, and more connect to this like constant scared state rather than action.
Mladenka, you have raised your hand. Mladenka, are you there?
Yes, I am muted, apparently. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Part of what you just earlier raised a bit of my attention and reminded me of my days in Montenegro Airlines. It really rang a bell on how we were handling the time disruption situations. And again, you were right in one of previous assessments stating not all airlines have the same capability and not all the processes are aligned. Even if the standards are there, they are not all to the line followed. So for this really small airline, regional airline, pretty much feeding out the passenger if they wanted to travel anywhere further than the region. This connecting thing was always a big thing. So what was happening with OCC and at the time commercial department, as I was in charge for distribution and afterwards follow up on revenue management and revenue accounting, was that as you said, they had completely different vision what was urgent for them to resolve in a situation of disruption, and they had disruptions at winter time period at certain periods due to the snow, for example, because the snow in Podgorica is an surprising thing, so it usually ends up blocking both airports, so you can't go out. And in that situation, after that, you really need to plan which are the priorities, because for a couple of days you're simply not flying. So at one moment of time, we saw that the operations had their own vision, because as you said, they come on a schedule, they see or not see what is going on, and they want just to head out whatever they can do first with the partners that they talk to. And that was not really aligned with the revenue that was coming to the airline or the cost of the flights that needed to be assessed. So the approach, again, a good thing for the small airline is you can get people together fairly easy. Even if we were in 2 different buildings, we decided to just have a meetings to state, okay, guys, you do what you need to do in terms of your operations, but these are priorities because this is where we are having a feeder passengers going to other carriers that we need to get out of our flights from, because they are going to cost us a lot, comparing to what you would prefer to head on with, I don't know, these shorter regional flights. And this is what was happening. So we used to log that in our systems to help kind of decision making for whomever is in charge on a day when disruption comes, and it kind of helped. But the fact was we never could really afford a big system to do that in more organized way, so to speak.
And I've seen it actually very often that people, of course, are trying to do something and at least put the remarks on the flights, you know, this is the priority, this is the priority. But again, it tends to get overlooked as soon as you can overlook it. So I don't know, it would be interesting to understand also point of view of Daniel, for example, like, are the systems able to work nowadays with the different priorities? That's one thing. And the other one, I know that you are not a big friend of the Gantt chart. What do you think? Because the Gantt chart is looking primarily at the aircraft movement, right? And that's what the operations control is trying to do, just to put the bars back to the original location. But how could we reasonably work with that we really merge all those things? And exactly, those passenger connections will be probably now even more important than before, because we are probably going to the times where a lot of connections will be gone, and at least for temporary period will be back to the connecting flights.
It's a very good question, and the answer on that, it's all about situation awareness. So I think people, of course, are used to stare on the Gantt chart, but the Gantt chart is a project management methodology data provisioning tool. And disruption management, you cannot now make a project plan how to work on a disruption. And also, I think the people and also the human brain, they are not able to cope with the amount of data. And we are talking a lot about additional data, big data, weather data, aircraft data, crew data, passenger data, revenue data. So the complexity of data has been increasing over the last years, and now people are overwhelmed from this amount of data. They cannot cope with that because the systems are not capable to digest all the data, and that's why they are losing the control. They always pretend to have everything under control, which you can easily measure with eye tracking technology underneath the screens where you can really see where is the eye movement going on the scan chart. So that's why the answer on that, it's all about situational awareness, which is exactly just visualizing the data, the relevant data, so fading away the unnecessary information. Everything which is green shouldn't really defocus the user, just put the focus on the critical items which are relevant, make use of technologies to also help the user that he is not required to flag what is the priority. You can all set this up in the system, and then based on the situation awareness, of course, guide the user to the Gantt chart. So I'm not saying we will steal the Gantt chart for the user. We will still use it for the routine task of swapping aircraft, replacing crew members, and so on. But I think it's all about situation awareness. And I think people use this. I'm always known that I'm raising here a smartphone up in the air because we have widgets and the situational awareness window on this tool. And I'm always saying I'm not going every day from A to Z through my address book in order to identify who has birthday. So somebody in the panel, by the way, has birthday today. I will not mention who. And it was, again, this tool who reminded me at 9 o'clock, based on my calendar, where his date of birthday is mentioned. And then I called him and gave him a nice birthday song. And I think the same technology can be used in the OCC. The technology is there. Of course, I trust this tool, and people need to trust this tool and the data, and then they can win a lot of time. They have a much better confidence in decision making, less errors, and at the end, it's saving a lot of money to the industry.
So I agree. We call it a process of managing by exception, because you only want to know about what's wrong, and you don't want to know about what's right. So if everything goes well, then there's nothing to do. But if something goes wrong, you want to be alerted to it. So it's managing that exception to your normal operations. That is the concept that you want to address.
Sure.
Sapna, you also raised your hand?
Yes, I was just noting that 81% of the respondents in the list had said clear rules for flight prioritization, and that was Mladenka also supported that kind of a concept. I've also been hearing that there is a movement towards learning from what was done in the past, like a machine learning, what was done in similar disruption in the past, and also a movement towards re-optimization rather than following a set of flight rules, re-optimize based on objectives like reducing your costs or reducing or minimizing changes in your planned schedules or rosters. So does that mean that only around 19% of the respondents felt that kind of movement will be there? Is it still a trend towards a correct list of flight prioritization algorithms, or is it a combination of both that's happening?
I think it's a combination of both, but I would be very careful about those 59% who say something in between, because sometimes the rules can be really, really vague, I would say, so it would still fall into it. But the thing is, and again, it's the mindset thing. Yes, as long as I'm human, we are all kind of creative and we want the wide borders, but once I translate it into the zeros and ones and I won't really do the management by exceptions, then it gets a little bit complicated, right?
So Martin, in your, did you see that kind of a re-optimization move, or do you think it's from what from your interactions, do you see that kind of a movement, or is it more still going to be a prioritized flight rules kind of movement in the future?
what do you mean by re-optimization? Because this is something what is happening now, and I'm actually a big fan of re-optimizing the day before operations really properly, and then of course some partial re-optimizations. I don't know if you can really re-optimize if you have airline with 250 aircraft, the entire program. What's the effort you have to put for it? But for me, it's like well planned is half of the battle, you know, and then if the operations control has to do the battle, that's something what they are used to, so let them be it, but give them the quality input at least.
Okay. To be clear, what I meant by re-optimization was whatever a kind of rerunning what was run at the planning stage with probably different priorities during the day of operations or tracking period. And I hope you're also saying that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Martin, please go on. Very interesting data. I love it.
Right. So now let's get a little bit to the customer itself, because we're talking about the customer satisfaction and importance, and it has the connection to the OCC, because on the left side you can see we're trying to understand how is actually OCC able to spread the information about the operational status and ad hoc changes in a consistent and timely manner. And you see that internally within the airline, it's somehow okay-ish, high 49%, medium 44%. So majority of them are so able to share the information within the airline. Once it gets to those system and service partners, it's still not so bad. I mean, the high could be much higher, of course, would be great, but still 72% are in the medium. But you see that it's starting to create a step. And then once you get to the passenger, it's already only in bracket 66% in the medium, and the highest out of the three categories, internally, externally, and external to the passenger, is 28%, where they are saying we are just not able to pass the information to the customer. You know, and in my opinion, it's partially the function of really everything being too manual at the OCC, and in the end, you know that you have to let the colleagues at the crew control know, you know that you have to let handlers know, but then you somehow lose the track, and you also don't have the tools, right? It's not the pure OCC function to inform the passengers, but in the end, you have to work with it somehow, and that's the right side of the graphics, where we were asking the airlines, how can your customers actually self-handle themselves? And especially in Europe, it has always been a big topic, and there have been quite a few interesting attempts in really customers being able to even book the hotel from their mobile device, and the refreshment vouchers and all that stuff. But still, you see that this, what we would call then full self-service options, is pretty low. And even the partial service, you get like up to the 40% across the categories. And then the rest of the customers, and bear in mind, we said that the customer satisfaction is one of our core targets. The rest is left just through the airport staff or airline call centers. I think each of us has used or has called at least once in life to the airline call center and experience how beautiful it is. Nowadays we have, of course, also the social media, but I'm not sure if the Donald Trump approach, just to push yourself in front of the queue when there are 100 people standing anyway, is something what you want as the airline in the systematic way. And least but not last, also when we ask about the satisfaction with the outsourcing, the airlines say actually the disruption handling, the customer disruption handling, we are the most dissatisfied with. You know, so that was quite interesting to see it for me, like where, as I said, the theory is the customer is the king and we do everything for him. But when we look into what it means for the customer, then it's a little bit painful.
Martin, do you have any data on recent behavior of airlines? Like, it just seems to be a little bit ago reading through airline stuff on social media, those airlines that seem to have a better self-service in these times of disruption seem to also equally have, less abuse on social media channels and better online presence. Have you got any recent data with regards to that?
Unfortunately not. Like when I was with one of the big airlines, I mean, hard to say if there is really a correlation between the social media and the self-handling tools. It was absolutely clearly increasing the customer satisfaction if you gave those self-handling tools, but not sure if people complained less, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, what I was getting at, but yeah, I see what you mean.
My experience, because I'm using Twitter very much when I was traveling a lot, especially last year, in order to try to get a rebooking from the airline, because I was always flying out of Berlin, always connecting somewhere. And there are some airlines, interestingly, American Airlines, for example, amazed me. They have the most advanced disruption management, also in regards to passenger handling. I was really amazed that while deboarding the aircraft in Philadelphia, somebody waited for me, had already the boarding pass printed, and I was not forced to go first to a ground staff and so on. They have also a very sophisticated app where all is really in real time communicated. Interestingly, I was better aware of what's going on about this disruption than the crew. So the crew was announcing we have to wait 2 hours, and I had already on my mobile departure estimated in 30 minutes. But that's a big exception from the rule. So the majority, I would say at least 90% of all airlines are not using really social media channels for a proactive communication to passengers. It's more playing games, marketing tools, because sometimes also the social media department is outsourced. So these are not experts from the OCC. I was also checking by just using the notion of ETD. Some Twitter handles of airlines don't know what is an ETD. And that's the reason why it's very rare that airlines are using social media communication. That they try to do it via SMS, and you can never be sure that the SMS is delivered in real time to the mobile phone. So that's an issue, and not everybody is also accepting roaming costs, which are then also something which is taking place if you're switching on the mobile.
I think there is a big discrepancy. You have the airlines who are big and who have the apps where they invested a lot of money, and there are really a lot of big airlines which have really cool apps. But then you have the smaller airlines which don't have the customer base of this size, and people just don't download because they have no reason, right? If I fly Lufthansa 25 times a year, then I probably download the app. But if I fly Czech Airlines once a year and I'm living in London, I will not download the application just because of the one flight. And that's also creating this kind of gap where all those big airlines with a stable customer base are able to communicate with them much better than the remaining.
MG.
Yes, so I just want to make a comment. So I've been spending a lot of time in Asia, and one of my one of the airlines that I've been working with have used bots to a great effect, and the call center volume has reduced between 60 and 70% by using bots on their websites. And then something that I think that the Chinese have done very well is integrated with an external party WeChat, where you can you can book your flights online, you can make changes, everything through an external integration with a social media product. So I've been very impressed with what the WeChat application has to offer. And I'm also looking forward to more bots and AI in this industry, because I personally hate calling a call center, because trying to get to a real life person is a monumental task.
No.
Yeah, it's a very, I don't know how many of you might have seen it. Recently, kind of a big airline in India had this huge social media blow out because of their chatbot. The guy was being a bit sarcastic. The engine could not recognize it as sarcastic, and then it just had a huge snowball effect across. I'm not sure. I'm not going to say the name of the airline because I don't want to offend anyone, but if you just Google it, you should be able to find out. It was, the guy was saying, "Thank you for ruining my marriage," and the chatbot actually responded saying, "Oh, we are very happy that you enjoyed the travel," and then that was it. So it's a two-edged sword. Yes, the chatbot can help you normally, but again, like what we discussed earlier, this is different time. So there are lots of chatbots things which have been pulled out recently.
They're really good for like basic rudimentary issues.
Yeah.
Like Air Asia has a really good tool, Ava, I think they call it. So I was actually in Asia when all of this started to fall over, and had the 5 or 6 sectors booked across a trip. Some of them I weren't eligible for refund. Some of them I got automated. Put my stuff in the chatbot, got refunds. Some I got credits for where I was applicable. They must have had some big, some like reference list in the background to say, okay, this nationality can go to these countries, and doing a whole lot of data matching to see. And I didn't have to talk to anyone the whole time. It went around in circles a few times. I got a bit confused every now and again, but on the whole, it was much better than sitting on hold.
Yeah. The problem with the chatbots is if you try to make it too complicated, so you go generational rather than rule-based, it can sometimes really go bad. So I was just trying to find out that screenshot that I had and share it with you guys, but I couldn't find it. When I get it, I'll post it. It was really funny, hilarious. Anyway.
And this, for me, it's a really, really interesting topic because it's not touching only OCC, it's touching also distribution and general communication of the airlines. And you are right, there are all kinds of these lovely tools that are coming out that are getting based on also NDC and general industry effort to kind of standardize this. But it's also reminding me to what I was talking about, how we handle disruption in Montenegro Airlines. It's really showing that this gray area between operation and distribution is also something that needs to be carefully attended by the airline. So there are all kinds of varieties of tools that you can get, and as you said, Daniel, some airlines are much better at communicating, some are not. It depends a lot on the passenger, whether they want roaming charges, whether they have internet access at the time, because for me, most of the time in Europe, I would get the messages, but when I reach my destination, simply because I'm running through the airport and not switching on my data on time to even see what is going on there. But there is a huge potential, in my opinion, on this in this part of area. Hopefully coming from NDC, because at the time is really, really hard to kind of marry legacy systems that exist on distribution to know all about the changes that are happening on OCC. So the new technologies are definitely something that it is awaited and apparently being rolled out way too slow for what the airlines are needing. And the COVID for me is kind of re-emphasizes this need.
Yeah, I think that's exactly also the challenge for the industry. I think the airlines were always focusing pretty much on tools, on optimizers, solvers, and so on, and nobody was really thinking through how we are really getting the horsepower on the street. And if we are here seeing that all the nice created scenarios and solutions you need to communicate with the affected crew members and then passengers. And if they are not getting it in time, then your nicely created optimized solution is not coming to play, and you need to reshuffle everything. So I think that's very important, that the entire process needs to be evaluated, and also an end-to-end decision-making process is supported from digital technology.
I like, Daniel, that you mentioned in time, because that's also, and that goes back to what we discussed already in when the operations control is making the changes, right? And like, of course, there will always be last moment changes, but like last summer, I was always going crazy when I got the delay message, like 45 minutes delayed, 15 minutes before departure, where you are like, okay, you now realize that you don't have either the crew or the aircraft, and that's where like really the commercial and operations have to go together, because all this communication with customers is somehow unwanted child. Everyone wants the customer to be happy, but no one wants to take the real ownership. Ops people are accused that they don't understand the customer and commercial topics, and vice versa, right? But yeah, this is probably one of the examples for further real integration.
And it's also a good sample how you can create even revenue out of a disruption. Because exactly. I'm always wondering, traveling, knowing already there's an ETD, why the gate agent is not announcing it. Yeah. Why? It seems also not everybody is using his smartphone while traveling, because if you're then saying, by the way, you have now half an hour more time or 1 hour more time, and by the way, we have a cooperation with this and this restaurant at the airport, you have a $10 voucher, the airport can make more revenue, you can really also mitigate the negative feelings from the passenger. So there's a lot of revenue potential, and it's all about communication. And I'm still not understanding why, when then the aircraft comes in too late, then suddenly the announcement, due to a late inbound aircraft, we are now, because we need time for catering and cleaning and blah, blah. All this could be already communicated, and people are all upset that the airline is not doing a great job. Or is it the handling agent? That's also exactly the topic which needs to be improved in the future.
Fully agree, and I think it's even exaggerated on the like long haul flights, you know, when it always drives me crazy when the flight departs Europe for New York already 4 hours late, and we let all the customers come because we again don't like this uncertainty. We don't like losing the revenue. We rather upset the customer, you know, because we at the end of the day we care more about the revenue we can take rather than the OTP on the arrival of the customer to his final destination and so on. And especially if you have like flights departing every hour, reshuffling the things, and that comes again to this connection between commercial and operations, where for operations it's just not important.
Yeah, but is this also not something which will change now? Sorry, Martin. Will this not change now in the COVID-19 situation? Do really the airlines want that passengers are all coming, grouping, maybe amplifying the spread of a virus, instead of having an just-in-time communication and being at the airport, boarding and so on, because it's exactly all about physical distance. Is this not then maybe a driver that this way of communication and process will be changed under COVID-19 situation?
Would be.
Yeah, I was just thinking of checking with Jeremy, who's on the call, how he's kind of, what more communications he's seeing on the passenger and crew side. Like, are there more airport restriction information or new check-in process information that that Indigo currently shares with their passengers and crew, so that they are, you know, really in time, real-time information access? Is there any changes in communications that's done on the Indigo side?
Yeah, I was trying to just listening carefully and quietly, but thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, it is a problem. I think if you could guarantee that everybody had an app downloaded and you could give them updates, then you can afford to tell them exactly what's going on. Traditionally, once the people are at the gate, you don't want them to leave the gate because they go to the bar, stay in the bar, and then miss the flight, and then you've got a further delay while you're dragging off bags and stuff like that. So I think that's part of the issue. I mean, like a lot of terminals now are silent, so people have to self-serve and look at the boards. Sometimes the boards aren't updated. I mean, we're talking to suppliers now where we have estimated times, and we know the estimated time of the flight, but we don't want to pass that on to the FIDS displays. We don't want to share it with passengers. So you've got to be careful. But if, like Daniel said, if there's a few airlines that I travel on, and I have their app in my hand, and it's, telling me it's boarding now or it's delayed or whatever, and it's brilliant. But the problem is that not everybody has that same contact point. So the only contact point you really have with them is at the gate. So, and a lot of times airlines are very much trying to basically keep the people at the gate and try and ensure as limited amount of delay as possible. But we spend a lot of time and effort with updates from, mainly over SMS. We do have an app. So if you book one of our flights, you basically get spammed on SMS, which is not necessarily a good thing as well. So everything from the fact that you can't check in with a power bank and all those sorts of things, to the gate number, to delayed boarding and delays on flights. But again, you've got to be very careful how you manage that, because not everybody is connected, not everybody is roaming. And the really frustrating thing is when you arrive, get off your flight, and then you get told that the flight was delayed because you didn't get the message before it departed. So then you arrive and you get a message saying, hey, the flight's delayed. So that's where we sort of have to strike a balance. And it's also then how much information do you provide as well? Because, sometimes that can have an impact on compensation, etc. So, often we know what the reason is, but usually it's just passed on to passengers as operational. And, to be honest, when I fly, I actually get up at the FID screens and check them out. So I know that I'm departing on X flight from X gate. So then I'm looking at when's the arrival time of the flight into that gate. And if that doesn't match up, you can usually get some heads up on working out, are you going to be delayed, how much you're going to be delayed, etc. All falls apart if there's a gate change. But, that's also something that is sometimes difficult to communicate to passengers as well.
Ladenka, you had a question.
It wasn't really a question, it was more of a comment, and now what Jeremy commented kind of ties in very well on what I intended to say a couple of minutes ago. The thing is, my experience also with the airport in Montenegro is pretty much the same. Every single airline, be it small or big, will use the opportunity to get passenger in the gate, which is really kind of funny from the passenger perspective, because we are talking about extremely small airport where you can go through security and the immigration check within 20 minutes at the worst peak, because it's simply not that size. So what you have of infrastructure at the airport is you have a nice cafe outside, not so big cafe on the gate side, and airlines, and each one of them will make you go through security to sit on the gate side, despite the fact that they know that the flight is delayed or on arrival for, let's say, half an hour, and plus additional half an hour until they, let's say, turn it around, clean it, or all the other stuff that they need to do to prepare it for the next flight. And what you can do as a passenger is just sit, because there's virtually nothing to do. So I thought it was really the unorganization on our side, but as Jeremy mentioned, it apparently not the case, and I had also similar experience. For me, it was also quite not clear who's doing the delay. Was it the airline or the representative ground handler at the time, because it's at their convenience? Because this was part of the cases as well, that sometimes in this partnership, the ground handling party just simply does what they deem fit, not to look up for the passenger if they go to the bar as stated earlier or not. And for me, it's also this type of communication between ground handling people within airline or third party would rather need to be enhanced in a manner and use more technology to better service the passenger at the end. Because we all traveled a lot, we all hate to be stuck at the airport and wait for the gate announcement that never comes. Then you go to the gate because you have no other option. You go to the gate where you are redirected, and then maybe somebody will tell you, no, it's not on this gate, it's somewhere else. That's really, really frustrating from the customer point. And the question is also whether this is going to aggravate after COVID, because many people will be asked to come far earlier, whether the infrastructure will support for more people at the same time, at the same place, and the health restriction that we are seeing now, or how this is going to evolve. Any questions in addition to this?
No, fully agreed from my side. Then let's move to the next one, and let's move a little bit from customer back to the technology which we are using in the operations. And it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on the automation, because we are asking the airlines along the process and in the different areas how they implemented automation, if they deem it successful, or if they don't have it at all. And that's the upper part of the graphics, where it's a little bit annoying for me. I mean, if we start with the dispatch, which has the highest share of the automation, that's actually not surprising, because all the leading providers have really automated solutions in place, and the flight planning itself is very data-based, so it's relatively easy to automate it. But then when it goes to the operations control and the crew control and maintenance and the passenger and so on, the automation capabilities are going down and down. And for me, the most challenging always has been that there is always quite a significant disparity between the operations control and the crew control. So two modules which are very tightly influencing each other. But as you can see on the top, for example, crew control is one of the areas where the unsatisfaction is the highest, and overall it was quite obvious that airlines, when they do the automation efforts, that some 20% of them fail. It might be because of the data, that's what's on the next slide. But it might be also because of the currency of the IT solutions, and that's the bottom part for few of the functions where, again, like the flight planning or dispatch systems are considered to be really state-of-the-art. But for example, if you look at the operations control, majority, or not majority, but I mean like 35% of the people will tell you the system is outdated, while another 30% of the people will tell you that the system is up to date, but they already foresee the risk that it will become outdated pretty soon. So,
Martin, do you have a pattern on this? Because I also remember your presentation from 2014 where you were showing the root cause of errors. And I remember the spike cake. And I think I was already asking you also in 2014 whether you could identify patterns, like you're using an IT system A and you are feeling not very well automated, or is this across all IT systems? Because let's say all Siemens S6 mobile cell phone users, of course, have the same feel compared to all Apple iPhone smartphone users. So is it an Apple orange comparison which you are showing here? Because you don't make the comparison to the IT systems.
It was more like, how do you feel that your function is automated? So it's across all.
Because that's something which might be the next step, that you have also a feedback loop. I remember another industry colleague made a survey how well digitized airlines feel, and everybody was very well digitized, and the reality is exactly not like this. And I'm always very interested to know, okay, are are you really using the tool? Are you not trained, what you're saying earlier?
Yeah.
Or is it maybe because everybody is using the same IT system, and then of course, if all have the same IT service provider, then of course the outcome is very clear.
Sure.
Okay.
Aaron, you also had a question on that, I believe.
Yes, Martin, it was more a bit generic. So when we talk about automation, what exactly is the definition for automation here?
Well, that's quite widely open, I would say. I think we defined it really, as we said here, in the operational areas which are affected by repetitive manual tasks and the level of the automation in these areas. So the question was going mainly like, are you more manual, or do you have really something where you can say that's fully or semi-automated? It was looking from the perspective of the user, how much manual work has to be done.
Okay. Because normally when we talk to airlines, and then they confuse between automation and optimization. So I was just wondering if that kind of a trend is inherent in this pattern that you have displayed. So that was what I was trying to get at. So yeah, I think I got it.
Okay, so any other thoughts, or should we move to the data?
Martin, did you see any higher trends? It is concerning that in the ops control and crew control area, there is less adoption of automation. Do you see a more regional trend towards somewhere in this?
Not, I will have a look at it once again, but in the overall survey, that was quite interesting. We thought about actually dividing it by the regions, but on the higher level, it was all the same. But I'll have a look later and let you know if I find something. Let me just write it down.
Thanks, Martin.
So if I may add on that, on the regional trend, with my experience, Asia versus Europe versus North America, I found a much higher take up on automation and optimization and predictive modules in Asia than in North America. So I agree with, so on automation, you said that it's taking anything that's repetitive away to give you a better solution, correct? Which could include optimization, to include predictive tools, that include AI. Now, I want your opinion, whether when you did this survey, did you take into consideration any human bias? Because the reason I'm saying that I found it more difficult in the US is there was a perception of, okay, now we have optimization. That means people are going to lose their jobs. That means for the HODs that they have less power because they've got less people that they control or that they manage. So they have smaller departments. So there's a much higher reluctance, and the change management requirements is higher. So was this purely data driven, or was there any discussion around the human bias around, are we being replaced by automation, and are we being replaced by new technology developments and integrations?
This part was purely data-based, and we were trying to remove the bias exactly by asking like the higher management, not the users themselves. But I exactly know what you are talking about, and we were looking into it in the past already. And yeah, exactly as you say, like it's a big change management thing, and the thing is that people are in the mindset that the roles will remain as they are. You know, that even though we have this increasing management by exceptional automation and so on, at the OCC, the roles are the same as 25 years ago. And I think that's a bit which is on the part of the management to realize that it's actually not necessarily about the cutting, but about using the advantages of the automation and management by exception by strengthening your power somewhere else. Like, for example, when we talked about this customer communication and all that stuff, so yes, if we are talking about this seat and if this is the old-fashioned ops controller, this function might be obsolete at some point, or we might need 3 instead of 7, but that doesn't mean that the whole OCC will shrink just because of the automation. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
And one important thing from it, because I was user of one of those advanced flight planning systems, and I think that's something what people are not realizing is you have to maintain them. You have to monitor what those systems are doing. It's a complete dream that you install the system and it will perform without any errors, and that's also this vicious circle, right? Because every time when so-called experienced ops controller discovers that the system did a mistake, it's like, okay, it's useless, it costs so much money, the IT was bothering us for 2 years and it doesn't work anyway. But in my opinion, all those advanced systems need not the back office, like every system needs the back office, but they need some specialist sitting at the OCC, because forget about the usual approach where the system generates some nonsense and you have to log the ticket with the IT, IT who doesn't understand the topic comes to you in 20 days, then you don't remember, data are not available, whatever. So in my opinion, this is something what we will need to increase in the OCCs, people who are really able to manage those systems, and at the moment, once the systems, for whatever reason, start to produce weird things, being able to step in.
Martin, I can't agree with you more on this. This quote that you just said, it needs to be put in bold, framed, and hang on every OCC, because this is something that people need to realize on how they should handle these kind of systems. It's not like handling your Word or Excel or anything. A complicated system, especially those having optimizers, machine learning models within them, they need to understand that there is a tuning, there is an evolution for that thing. I can't agree with you more on this. I have to say this. Absolutely brilliant point.
But does it mean that we also need a different skill set of people working in the OCC? Because if you are not putting an untrained and unqualified pilot in the cockpit, because he has also to understand all the instruments, all the data, he needs to double check, is this what I'm getting alerted really making sense? And I think if we are now applying all these technologies like machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, and so on, people also need to understand the correlation of that and need to understand, is the system really showing me something which is relevant, or is there maybe something which I can ignore? So does it mean we will need a different kind of training for these people? We need a certificate? Yes. Like a dispatcher is also half a pilot. So do we need this kind of people also in the OCC?
In my opinion, yes. And like how we were handling it in the EasyJet, for example, their supervisor at the dispatch was purely looking actually into what the system is doing. Like, yeah, on the side, you somehow manage the shift, but the production itself, you didn't care about it too much, but you had some extra capability and some extra training to be really able to manage the system, to be in constant communication with the system provider, and really fixing the problems on the go and not within months.
Daniel, I would also say that there is a mindset change that is required to actually accept these kind of systems, right? Rather than, because yes, these systems initially will give you errors, but the idea is to actually understand that you need to consider the system as a child, and that needs to grow in your environment to deliver the benefits that the system provider or the system is actually promising. So that mindset is huge, and that is what I think that's going to be the most challenging part, because as service providers, we can always provide a technician to assist them, right? But if 90% of the users starts just crying over that system because they don't get the right mindset in place, that's where I find the biggest challenge. that's where the the vision from the senior management breaks down when it comes to the execution level. I think that's the bridge.
I think that's a nice bridge for you, Martin, that Arun is using the term new mindset.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, but overall, I'm a big fan in mixing the people among the industries, and I think here in the operations, we are a little bit falling a victim of the regulation of the industry and of majority of the management coming from the usual OCC. So the usual path is that ops controller will become a management at one point, right? But and on the top, because of all the seniority things, we rarely change the airlines. Actually, you'll usually change the airlines because you have to, not because you want to. And it all is creating really rigid mindset where we are all still thinking only in certain patterns, and in my opinion, we really need to get some clever data guys who like operations into it, who kind of merge both worlds, and leading by example, of course, as always. Like especially at the operations control centers, it's really hard to manage the people, right? If you as the manager see them maybe once per week because of the various shifts, then this is something what is also, from my perspective, a little bit underestimating. So first of all, vision, and clearly communicating this vision, what do you actually want to achieve, why are you doing things, and what will be the result of the potential automation, and then really even the daily management of the workplace. And I'm afraid that we are not really good in it. So we are somehow blending this weak human management capabilities with relatively potentially strong IT capabilities, and this is the result where we are.
So Martin, maybe you go on with your presentation.
Exactly, and here we have just a few things on the data. Where we were asking them, how are you sourcing the data? Because we're working also on some bigger projects in the past where you realize that it's a big problem. And the left part is my favorite one, where we asked, how are you collecting the operational data? And the majority of them still really rely on the classical manual input by the ground staff, or such as the delay codes. Then, of course, more and more you are using the ACARS data, which, let's say, you cannot influence or can slightly influence in some cases. Manual data input by the cabin and cockpit staff is the next one. Then you have a lot of airlines are fortunately using more and more data from the DCS, which are again kind of automated. And then the camera monitoring made some inroads in the industry. But when you look what is happening as a reality, you think that you have a lot of data, so that you can do anything with that, but that's not really true. And the point is that you take all those data coming from the random sources and you put them together, you shake it, and then you are trying to get something out of it. And that's what I was mentioning earlier, that in my opinion, you really have to make a cut and to say, okay, what do I want to achieve and which data do I need for it? Not the other way, which data do I have and what I can do with that. Because if you go with this approach, then you can see on the right side, then even like in the real-time KPIs, you rarely get over the 50%. Not saying this is the most important, because I have my view on the KPIs, and I think overall the KPIs which we are using are really outdated, and we need to look more into the planning KPIs, process KPIs, customer journey related KPIs, but not the customer satisfaction only itself. But that's what I see as a really long and hard way ahead to convince the airlines that the on-time performance is not the only KPI you could use.
Martin, is it then maybe time to rename the job profile of the person working in an OCC? Because we always call them ops controller, but we are all learning that in fact they are data typists. So Is it then the right term for their job profile?
Never thought about it. The question is what would be the impact in terms of the change management? How much would they freak out? But no, this is nothing what the ops controller honestly can influence, right? How are you collecting the data and what you are doing with them? He's kind of the middleman. And ideally, you should give him those KPIs and the data in the form he can work with them. She can work.
Well, I know many airlines where the pilots go on strike or the cabin crew member go on strike. I've never heard that OCC personnel went on strike because the company is not equipping them with the right tools, is not streamlining processes. So that's why I think, and that's always my my wish for the industry. Everybody is part of the success of the airline, and I think, as Arun said, people have to understand their system is like a child, and they have to bring it to school, to university, and so on. And that's why they have somehow also the responsibility to tell their management, we need something better, and there is something better. Please bring it to my workplace, that I can take better decisions, that I really have the ops under control.
Yeah. So
I think this nice Brexit term, take back control, I think that's a good term also for the entire airline operations environment.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I actually really like in Agiforce when American Airlines were mentioning that they are now trying to evaluate the impact of the OCC decisions, because this is also something what helps you in this loop. And I was really happy that someone is starting to do it, because that's one of the toughest parts. Actually, you know how the business cases are usually built, and if you need to really find the benefits or disadvantages of the things, it's really hard, especially when using this kind of the data. And maybe I switch straight away to the next slide, where we are also talking about like how are you able to identify the root causes, and how are you able to establish the disruption costs, you know. And that's exactly the thing which goes together. If you don't know what's the result of what you have done, then it's surely relatively difficult to argue that you need something better.
But I remember Michael Clark's statement in this disruption management panel, where he said it would be better to consider the revenue in the case of a disruption and not just the cost. Because earlier, the airline made entire network and schedule planning in order to generate revenue, and in the case of a disruption, suddenly cost is the topic. And Jeremy and me, we were discussing this already earlier during the virtual happy hour, but what is your perspective on that, Martin?
From my perspective, you have to merge them. And I'm actually, even though I have here this chart ability to establish disruption cost, notice that I'm saying with a satisfying level of detail and within reasonable time frame. I'm not a fan of all those people who freeze, because the OCC cannot really, with the detail to single euro, establish what will be impact of the decision. I really think that some high-level estimates are good enough for some decision making, but you are right, more and more the revenue has to be definitely taken into the consideration. But you cannot use either or, you need to use both with the reasonable level of the approximation that the detail doesn't kill you. What's the other's opinion?
Brian, you are so silent today. I'm really amazed about your silence. So hopefully you are sharing your.
No, I'm just listening. Is that okay? Nothing wrong with that, right?
No, absolutely. But I'm totally unused to that.
I know.
I'm knowing you. Oh, you are so impressed from Martin's presentation, and you are speechless. That might be also a reason.
No, it's interesting, the discussion. You know, you hit on a number of things that kind of key to me. You know, you talked about the typical OCC person, where that person comes and how they grow up in their training, and et cetera. But, you know, looking at some of the data, you clearly see that these people don't get enough training. And if they do get the training, most of it's the minimal training. Yes, I think you made a really good point about the systems. You can't just plug in a system and expect it to be working 100% of the time without any glitches, without any bugs, without true support. And true support, of course, doesn't come from your internal IT people, because they really don't understand the system as well as they need to. So it would be a great, perfect world if we bought these systems, we integrated these systems, and then we would have one of those system experts in our OCC or in our company to support us every time it went down or we needed that. But the reality is that's just too expensive. So no, I'm just kind of ingesting it and understanding how this great industry will bounce back from this, hopefully with a much better IT infrastructure and support.
But Brian, I was asking earlier, is COVID-19 changing something completely? Is it now an opportunity to rethink airline operations? Is it a good time to start a business transformation, or will COVID-19 just transition to a business as usual and just reduced fleets, reduced workforces, but everything stays as it is since many years?
Well, we pray it doesn't stay the same, because clearly you need integrated systems across the board for airlines that talk to each other, that are on the fingertips of the users, and we can communicate with our customers and our fellow partners, because no matter what, you're never going to go away from outsourcing. Many of the airport positions, many of the ground handling, it's just the way of the world. It makes sense. So yes, it's truly needed, but is the horsepower out there? Are the managers out there, the new wave management? You know, I'm not a young man, but at the end of the day, I always think of how we can do something better the next day. We look in the mirror and say, how can we do it better? So we hope and pray, Daniel, that is real. This is going to help revolutionize the systems out there.
Martin, do you want to continue with the presentation?
Yeah, just to very quickly finish it, because I see we have already 2 hours passed. Just on this right side, I don't think it's super surprising, but when we were asking also, when you have the predictability challenges and we were trying to look at the fleet size of the airline, what is happening, it was quite obvious that the smaller you are, the bigger problem is the data quality and availability. Once you become bigger, it improves, but on the other hand, you get killed by IT constraints, meaning probably too many solutions which don't communicate with each other. And of course, the complexity of the processes itself, which is quite understandable. But then the last part, and this is something which I wanted to remind, because as I said at the beginning, it's not only about the planning and steering, but also about the performance management of yourself and performance management of your providers. And the reality of the industry is that we outsourced whatever we could, but the question is how we are steering the providers. And I think there is also a little bit of a gap where we normally steer the providers ad hoc, right? So we look at the beginning of August, what has happened on the 1st of July with the ground handler, and then we use some bonus and malus system and all that stuff. But we are struggling with this integrated planning, as we discussed, and we are struggling also with various reports and the KPIs and the simple things where each of us is still using a separate database. So even those never-ending discussions, what was the reason for the delay? And also, how are the data captured during the typical turnaround? You know, where are the data coming from, if they are coming from it at all? Because once again, the turnaround is one of major activities which is happening, like which you can somehow influence through the provider. And this is really, in my opinion, here we need to get more into this process view, in the sub-process view. But again, this is something where we found in projects that many airlines just don't have any data at all. For them, it's like arrival, departure, that's it. Something happened in between. Yeah, it was probably the fuelers, but was it really? No one knows, you know. So I think this is something where it would be worth to look into it, not only refresh the SLAs themselves, where especially the low-cost airlines brought a big plus or created a big benefit for the industry, because they came with some innovative ideas how to steer the providers and how to motivate them to deliver. But really then those SLA reports and automation based on the KPIs and seeing those process deviations, that's something what is relatively important for me, and what I think is sometimes another a little bit overlooked part of the passenger of the entire operations process. And bottom right, I was mentioning it already, it was also quite nice to ask them, okay, if you are outsourcing the service, where are you dissatisfied most? And as you can see, again, the dispatch works, but then over the various function, it gets up to the passenger irregularity services, and then you have really 41% where it has some outsourcing it. Yeah, it's great, it's cheap, but actually I'm not happy with what I'm getting, and that's a big question mark for me, especially as you have like the RAM handling, passenger handling, and passenger IREC. So the closer, again, gets to the beginning, the closer you get to the passenger, the more dissatisfied you are with the service you are getting. So.
But that's exactly something which is striking me, because I think in the case of a disruption, you need to have really also the brand awareness of the airline. You need to have the passion for the airline to heal the disruption. And I can fully understand that any third-party handling agent who has now this responsibility for 20 airlines, 50 airlines, he is just a contractor, and he has not his heart beating for the airline brand. He has to now work on the disruption, and I think that's something where the industry needs to think about it, because exactly when something is going wrong, I need to have somebody who is taking me serious as a passenger, who is trying to even convert this very negative feeling of a disruption and make it a very positive moment. What I was sharing about American Airlines, even knowing they have a system from the 70s in place, I was amazed how they were handling a disruption. And I'm telling this now to everybody in the industry. I was affected from a disruption from another airline in Hong Kong, where exactly the handling agent was part of the problem. And that's for me another negative sample, which I'm telling around, not in this forum, but in bilateral talks. And that's, I think, really damaging also the brand image of airlines, if they are not understanding that exactly in a disruption situation, you have to have the focus on the passenger and also the heart beating for the airline, who is the root cause for the disruption.
I mean, yes, I agree. Like, definitely the providers are the problem. The world is what it is, so we hardly get back to insourcing the operations. But from my perspective, at least really improving those communication channels and providing them with information, because in my opinion, very often they are at least indifferent, if not upset, because also they are getting all the information too late, you know. So I believe that very often they would love to actually be professional towards the passenger, but if you have on one side passenger shouting on you, and on the other side airline not providing you with the information which can help you and the passengers, then of course you get stressed in between, and the result is what it is. But anyway, so let's just finish more or less. So that was just the high-level thoughts. Like, okay, we said at the beginning, like there is a lot of things, ideas which could have been done. So why aren't we farther? And in my opinion, when I was thinking about it, I always came to kind of three things. One was people and organization. The second one was the data and the technology. And then, of course, the cost. The cost issue, I don't think we need to discuss that. Always there will be discussions. What's the price versus value and capital cost versus operational cost. But if you look at this people, organization, and data and technology and the yellow frame, I'm afraid that there is really so much of stuff which we can influence within the airlines internally, but we prefer to close eyes over it, starting with this mindset, targets, KPIs, communication, and so on, training, but also the data, because in the end we are the owners of the data as the airlines, right? So again, we need the vision, which data we want to have available, in which quality, the real time, and so on. And then of course there are all those fancy words: automation, management by exception, integrating intuitive solutions, and so on. But I'm not saying that the providers are perfect. No, they are not. But in my opinion, we are in the situation where a lot of things is available if we really did some housekeeping before, that we are still kind of hitting the wall by having something available. It's not perfect, but we are not perfect either, and then we are just blaming each other. And of course, now everyone will say, well, there is a COVID, so it actually doesn't matter anymore. The situation will be completely different and so on. But in my opinion, we are just too fooled by the fact that I mean, even here, when I look at the window, that's why I'm looking to the side every time when the aircraft takes off. But like, we have now takeoff every 5 minutes in Frankfurt or something like that, so it's no longer situation like, yeah, we don't use the 2 runways at maximum capacity, but I think a lot of people got fooled by a complete stop of the operations and saying, yeah, and now it will be like hard and the operations will never come back. I mean, yes, it will be slow and difficult ramp up, but also what will the environment do? The environment will shrink as well. Like, why would airports and ATC and the providers keep the same workforce? Of course, everyone is trying to optimize. So my point of view is that actually we were in the big box with many aircraft, and now we are going into the smaller box, but that doesn't mean that we will still not be touching the size of the box by our aircraft. And on the top, there will be additional problems, of course, all those hygienic rules, things like yesterday in Germany, the whole region with 400,000 people was put into the quarantine, right? Fortunately, they don't have the airport, but this will be happening, and the operations will have to work with it. Everyone will keep telling them in the next 2-3 years, forget about any money, because we have to earn them or pay back whatever we have borrowed. And on the top, the passengers will be, in my opinion, very soon furious. They are at the moment, some airlines are, in my opinion, fooling themselves by saying, yeah, we have the great customer satisfaction. But in my opinion, current customer satisfaction is kind of gratefulness of the passengers that at least something flies. And this will go away at some point, and then it will be really, okay, I got upset because I had to be at the airport 4 hours before departure, then stupid queues everywhere, various rules, no service on board, waiting here, waiting there. So I think we'll have to be really careful about this. And as you said, in my opinion, it's like a chance to change something. It will not bring the things on its own. Like, as every crisis, yeah, it will have some impact on how we are doing the things, but unfortunately, as usual, it's not automatic. So people who will want to change something and do something will do so, and people who decide to remain blind will remain blind. And from my perspective, and that's really the last word, and I don't want to go through it with the detail, but that's why I divided the slide into the left side and the right side, where on the left side, I'm saying, really, let's use the time to make the basics right, because all this housekeeping and making the things correct to be able to use them this automated intelligent solutions. Now, in my opinion, it's the right opportunity, and many of this, or a lot of this housekeeping comes at a very low cost. So I don't accept the excuse, like, yes, if you tell me we need a new ops control system now, I'll probably tell you wait. But if we are talking about really the rules, at least some data, you know, processes and so on, now with the relatively quiet traffic, that's the time. That's my perspective.
I completely agree with that.
Thank you, Martin. I think that was really an awesome presentation. And also thank you to all the attendees for this very lively dialogue. I'm really amazed how we really kicked off this Virtual Ops 2020 season. Was a fantastic start. And also all the people from Australia and other regions of the world who had to drop off because it was very late for them already, gave in the chat box already a nice feedback. I hope you are also joining one of the upcoming sessions we are going to schedule. I hope, Martin, you are then also joining us. I think your expertise and all the insights from many airlines, I think it's a big asset also for other people from the industry. And I hope we can work together in order to transform the business of airlines and automate things where automation makes sense. We are reducing disruptions, which have a tremendous cost impact for airlines. And I think airlines need every single coin to go through this crisis, but also in the future in order to improve the service and the quality for the passengers. So thank you very much for everybody. We will share this recording with you. We will also share the slides from Martin. And if you want to give us feedback after this session, please do not hesitate. And also spread the word about the Virtual Ops 2020. I posted the link of the event page into the chat box as well. And then hopefully we see each other soon again. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, and thanks for the great discussion. Take care, guys.
Very insightful presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, Tim.
Bye. Bye.